Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to my ritual night talk for June 8th. I'm Scott Stenwick, your host for these ritual night events, hosted under the auspices of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So tonight, the topic I'm going to be talking about is related back to the exotericism discussion that we've been having, but I'm calling it cult versus culture, okay? And it's, in addition to being kind of a clever wordplay, right? Of course, it's hard to resist. I want to talk a little bit about and refine a few of the ideas that I've mentioned previously. So I don't have any additional content for this posted under the description. I do have the donation link. Feel free to put in a donation to Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota, if it be your will. We appreciate donations of all amounts. Now, moving forward with the topic for tonight. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this idea of, so I'm saying magic should be exoteric, okay? As in, magic should just be a thing that is not necessarily, that's just, part of the world, part of our lives, not necessarily something that is, secret or hidden or mysterious or any of that stuff. There's enough mystery, quote unquote, in the practice of magic to begin with, as in, once you start doing magic and you start doing practices, you're going to get some results that, that in terms of, what you're going to do personally experience from doing that, which is really not something that is easy to teach. And it's not something that is easy to explain. It's like, explain gnosis to someone who's never experienced it. I mean, you kind of can't. I mean, you can maybe give a few signposts or whatnot of, well, it kind of feels like this, but until you experience it, you don't really recognize it. And the way that you experience it is by doing practices, okay? And so beyond that, I mean, all the secrecy about magical technology, as I previously argued, is kind of silly, in my opinion, okay? So one thing I do want to note is I have in the past complained about this gatekeeping idea that some people do. And I was recently saw a video which made a distinction, and I think it's an important distinction between gatekeeping and toxic gatekeeping, okay? So I'm going to say that. I'm going to talk about, when I say gatekeeping, I mean toxic gatekeeping. And here's what I mean by that. Okay, so it is a gatekeeping thing for me to say, okay, if somebody were to come up to me and say, oh yeah, this is part of the Thelemic tradition, and proceed to do a ritual like from some completely different tradition. Well, I'm going to say, okay, you might be acting Thelemically in the sense of it's your will to do this kind of work, but is it part of the Thelemic tradition? I mean, if it comes from a completely different tradition and it's just out there, it's like, well, I'm going to say that, well, that's really not the Thelemic tradition. And that is kind of gatekeeping. I'm saying, well, you're trying to bring something in here that is just totally doesn't fit with the schema of the tradition that I practice. And so I'm not going to tell you not to do it. I mean, I suppose there are some people who would, and that's kind of where the toxic part comes in. I'm not going to tell somebody that not to do it, or they shouldn't work with it, or they shouldn't do any of these things. But it is incorrect to say that it's part of the Thelemic tradition. I was actually caught on this myself within the last year or so in some of my expositions on magic. And you'll see this in some of the older stuff on my blog. So I was operating at one point assuming that rituals like the lesser ritual, the pentagram, lesser ritual, the hexagram, those rituals as published in Crowley's Liber O were basically Golden Dawn rituals. Okay. And the idea I had was, well, Crowley went and got, his 5=6 from Mathers. And then he just took the 5=6 papers and put it into Liber O. And that's where, and so, really Crowley, he's doing these Golden Dawn rituals, and his own rituals are like the Star Ruby, Star Sapphire, which are his rituals. But as this was borne out in discussion from people who are actual Golden Dawn initiates, which I am not, okay, that that there actually are some significant differences even between, the ritual of the pentagram as done in the Golden Dawn and versus what Crowley published in Liber O. And the Liber O versions are more properly also part of the Thelemic tradition because of those changes. They're really not Golden Dawn. It would be Golden Dawn if I went and pulled up, the original Golden Dawn paper, the ritual of the pentagram, and did it that way. So, and that's a case where, well, yeah, so from that point forward, I've tried to make the distinction that basically what I am talking about is the Thelemic tradition. To people who get on my blog, say, hey, what about this Golden Dawn this? I say, well, I am an initiate of the Thelemic tradition, not the Golden Dawn tradition. Here's what I think, but you maybe want to talk to an actual Golden Dawn initiate to get the right answer. And so I don't think I don't see that kind of gatekeeping as necessarily problematic. The kind of gatekeeping that I'm talking about is the idea that, well, I'm going to invest all my time and effort in getting on these discussions on the internet, and I'm just going to go spend my time telling people that they're wrong. Okay? That has a terrible effect, okay? Even if somebody is wrong about something, okay? It really is not helpful to just kind of be like, well, you need to go back and study more or something like that, instead of actually talking about, or even talking about why they're wrong and explaining it. I see this all the time. And it's one of the reasons that I stay out of a lot of these internet discussions. And when I do get involved in them, I basically will just try to directly answer questions, because it's like, I'm not remotely interested in discouraging anybody from practicing magic. Even if they do it in like a totally weird, idiosyncratic way, if it gets results, it gets results. And that's where I come from. I'm a technologist. I'm like, okay, it gets results. Okay, if it gets results in a way that, wow, according to what I know, I don't see why it should get results, I go ahead and try to figure out what could be behind that. Why would there be a result here? I've done a similar experiment. It doesn't work. And sometimes that really does break down to just individual differences. Magic can work differently for different people. And this is the thing I've been harping on lately about not having a general theory of magic. We don't have a kind of scientific structure that we could sit down and we can say, all right, if somebody says they did this and they got this result, they definitely are misinterpreting their data or something like that. We don't have that, okay? What we have is we have a bunch of, traditions that came out of, these secret order kind of traditions. Magic became, more public, but still a pretty marginalized thing. Going forward from that, and the modern era stuff is up on the internet. It's available. The problem is really, it's like this overload, though, of information. And so you could find information all over the place, and it can be hard to know exactly what to do. And so, another form of gatekeeping that I don't really think is problematic is recommending that beginners try out the rituals as they are before they start experimenting with them. Okay, I have run into people who, oh yeah, but if I did the ritual of the pentagram with this and this and this, would it be more powerful? It's like, well, and this is like before they've actually learned it, okay? And I'm like, well, I do think that, you should learn it and practice it before you start wanting to make changes to it. I don't know where this comes from. There's a lot of people like this that I see out there who they see, okay, well, this is a ritual that, and they have this urge to like tinker with it because something doesn't make sense. But, I would say go ahead and, spend a couple weeks learning the ritual, make sure that you're doing it, okay? And make sure that you have some sense of how well it's working. And then, apply the scientific process. Okay, if you want to start making changes to it, make changes to individual things, do the ritual with that one change, see how it seems like it works, and so on. And so instead of just flipping it around because it doesn't make sense, practice it so you get into the groove of it, and then apply a scientific process going forward. But again, I am not sitting here, I'm recommending that. I'm not saying that somebody couldn't come up with some brilliant insight just out of the blue and have it work. They could. And they very well could hit on something that, none of the existing traditions have hit on. Magic is still very much in flux like that. Magic is a sort of proto-science in the sense that we apply some aspects of the scientific method to magic, but others are very difficult to apply, if not impossible, like measuring things like consciousness, for example, which is the most obvious of those. And see, the skeptics like to say pseudoscience instead of proto-science. And the reason that I like proto-science better, obviously, is it's less pejorative, right? So the skeptic movement is more about, well, if you can't follow the scientific method, what you're doing is fraud or deception or something like that, hence pseudo. I'm not trying to present the occult as science. I'm trying to present it as a process that can be as science-like as we can get to at the point we are at, hence proto-science. I do believe that we will get to a point where we have a general theory, but we sure don't now. And we shouldn't have people out there, in my opinion, I think it's counterproductive. I'll say that. I think it's counterproductive to the widespread study of magic to be, just constantly critiquing people. Oh, you say, what about this on a discussion forum? They just get dogpiled by a bunch of people, right? Oh, you're so wrong. You're bad. Whatever. It's like, who has time to do that? I mean, I tend to think that people who spend a lot of time doing that, it's like, don't you have something better to do with your magical practice? But again, people have the right to speak as they will. And I'm not, trying to censor speech or anything like that. I just think that, if you are somebody who does that, if you are somebody who's real invested in that, maybe you want to examine your motives and see what you're trying to do. If your motive is to keep magic exclusive and secret and away from people who you think are unworthy, okay, if that is what your motive is, well, your motive is very much at odds with mine. And so basically, we just disagree, and that's that. I don't think there's really much I could say about that. But for somebody who does share the goal of magic being a more widespread thing, being a more, ordinary thing in our culture, not some little niche thing that a handful of people do, but something that people use routinely in the course of their daily lives to make their life better. Okay, well, then I think you might want to look at it and say, well, okay, so actually Scott Stanwicky's got a pretty good suggestion there as far as, if that's the goal that you have. Okay. Now, the cult side of this is actually where a lot of this kind of toxicity comes in, right? So the main difference between a cult and a new religious movement these days is basically a cult is toxic, right? And well, toxicity, it's a thing you kind of know it when you see it. Generally, you have massive toxic gatekeeping around the cult. You have like levels and stuff. You have to do all this stuff. You have to do all this work. If you're found worthy, you'll be advanced to this. Then you'll get a little bit more. There's always this carrot that's held out. Some of these cults, they exploit their members for ridiculous amounts of labor. Oh, you only need to sleep 4 hours a night. You should be able to just work till you drop, sleep a few hours, get up, start doing more work for the cult. It can be people who are, coerced into doing all sorts of stuff for the leaders of the cult. And, so, well, we're holding out this carrot that we're going to give you the secret that we have, but only if you do this. It's like, that kind of thing is exactly what makes people look at things like magic and new religions as, oh, it's just crazy. Jonestown, or, it's like NXIVM, that came out in the last couple of years. Or, Scientology, and they're like, league, anybody criticizes Scientology, they send like lawyers after them and sue them. And, they surveil previous members who leave and stuff like this. And it's like force people to disconnect from their families who are still involved because they're suppressive and all this kind of stuff, which if we had an exoteric idea of magic and, therefore an exoteric idea of spiritual development, well, we wouldn't have that. Okay. It would be a thing where, oh, here is how a lot of people think that this works. Oh, this cult over here is saying that. It's like, oh, well, I can just study this. And then they don't have this carrot that they can pull people in and manipulate people and all this. And it would help a great deal with that, I think. And so the idea of a culture in which magic is exoteric is kind of like a movie that I saw a while back. One of my favorite movies, actually. It's been criticized by some people. It's some parts that are a little bit hacky or corny, but it's a movie called Cast a Deadly Spell. It's with Dennis Hopper, and it's like the idea is that it's like this film noir kind of Hollywood where people practice magic. Okay, and it opens with this montage, which is just fantastic. Okay, and this montage, it's like magic, it's all the rage, everyone's doing it, showing people like doing spells and all this kind of stuff. And of course, they're like fantasy novel spells, like conjuring stuff out of nothing and all these kinds of things that, if it's possible to get them to work, they're pretty difficult, right? And some of them are probably flat out impossible without doing stage magic. But the point is that, well, if people just did magic as a result of going about their daily lives, our world would be different, and I think our overall culture would be different, okay? And so, especially if you've got a lot of people doing magic, like I talked about the other week, doing magic in a style that is like a sorting problem kind of situation, because magic is super good at those. If you've got all these elements like in a complicated cloud of events, and you want to say, well, I want to match myself up with the thing that's going to get me what I want. Okay, so that's the sorting problem. And magic is real good at that. You have all these degrees of freedom, probabilities can shift all over the place, and you can bring stuff together. Okay, and furthermore, the more people who are doing that, the better everything works. And that's really what the key is. Okay, I honestly think this idea of, that this is kind of the practical side of this idea of, well, if, everyone in the world were, spiritually developed, spiritually enlightened, whatever you want to call it, the world would be a better place. Well, I think that's definitely true from a personality standpoint, because you're going to find that people who are doing legitimate spiritual work, they're less reactive. And there's a whole lot of bad stuff that happens because people are reactive to a situation instead of really proactively and intelligently approaching a situation in such a way that, they're going to get the thing that they want. Okay. But also on a practical level of how well things work. Okay, if you have a whole bunch of people, if you have 1 million people casting these, sorting problem kind of spells to bring them things that are in harmony with their will and put them in situations with people, with events, the will of which they are in harmony with. So this kind of flip thing. I originally started working on that specifically for love spells to avoid casting love spells on specific people, which is hard, and there are ethical questions around it. It's like doing a spell to directly distort another person's will is really difficult, and you will find a great deal of resistance, as opposed to you're going to manipulate a situation into which the person who is in harmony with you and you being in harmony with this person, so the both of you being in harmony together can just sort together. But that works for everything. It's not just love spells. It works for jobs. It works for really obtaining just about anything, and changing your life circumstances, if that is something that you want to do. So basically, what we would have is we'd have a bunch of people doing all this practical work toward getting a world that was aligned with the true will or pure will of more people. Okay, and that is the kind of macrocosmic external side of creating a better world. Okay. And, so on the microcosmic personal side, it's working with yourself, working with your personality, so you don't promulgate stuff that's going to create situations that aren't in harmony with your will. And then the macrocosmic side is you are shifting stuff around in such a way that you and other people with wills similar to yours are drawn kind of in the same direction. And again, it's like, it isn't really a situation where having it secret benefits anybody. So one person doing that will produce, some reduction of inefficiency in the overall world and how it works. But, like thousands of people doing it are going to have a much bigger effect. And so everything is kind of being pushed in this direction of, people with this will going in this direction, people with this will going in this direction, and so on. And what happens is that you get a world where everything at least works more smoothly. I don't think that would solve every problem in the world. I mean, there's the idea in Thelema that, oh, if everyone did their will all the time, there would be no clashing between people. I don't think I believe that. But I do think that there would be a lot less. And I think that more people out there doing magic is awesome and would help lead to a situation in the world where less of those kinds of conflicts occur. Okay. So, from a cultural standpoint, how do we do that as magicians? Now, I was having a conversation with a friend the other day about the idea of, culture and magic, and I completely misunderstood what they were talking about and got this idea in my head that by, magical culture, I was talking about some of this like fashion kind of stuff, like in a culture and all this sort of thing, which personally I'm kind of disdainful of. I feel like my approach to magic is more about how does the technology work, and I'm not going to tell, to be clear, that's where my interest lies. There are people who are doing, interesting things with aesthetics that incorporate magical elements and things like that. And that's cool. Okay. And more of that is fine. Okay. It's not really my focus. I will say, though, that if we're going to get to a situation where the culture that we have is really infused with magic, okay, talked about this idea of, we really don't need to re-enchant the world, we need to re-enchant ourselves. Okay, well, culture is an extension of ourselves, though, and how systems work, how people interact, and so on. And culture could maybe use some re-enchantment. And so, one of the ways that we can certainly do this as magicians, I think, is to focus on, if you are an artist, if you are a writer, if you are, you do any sort of art. And, I think most magicians I've met have at least something of an artistic kind of bent. I'm a writer. I've met, other magicians who are visual artists, who are sculptors, a lot of body art tattoo artists in the OTO, for example. And people do a lot of different kinds of art. And I do think that art is one way that magicians, if we're doing art that genuinely embodies these magical principles, these ideas that, doing a piece of art that represents the state of consciousness of this, and do it in such a way that, it draws people in, and do it in such a way that, people see representations like that all over the place. That's going to do a lot to exotericize magic. It's going to mean that, to some extent, I think that some of that is happening. In the last, 20, 25 years, we're seeing, big moves like in entertainment and stuff like that. People talking about, fantasy, urban fantasy, magical themes. You're seeing it in writing, and you're seeing it in, visual arts and so forth. And that's all great. It's like, the more people see this stuff, the less weird it's going to be. And the more it's going to be like, that interests me. I saw this piece of artwork and that really draws me in. What's that about? And that's something that can bring people to, oh, well, it's magic. Okay. So then, to practice magic, then I would want to learn, this and this and this. And, making the information accessible, which it is, pretty much everywhere. Putting together some stuff that can guide people in the right direction, which is, what I've tried to do on AugoIDs with my magical instruction link and stuff like that. And really being open to this idea that, as Crowley put it, magic is for all. Okay. And by magic, I do mean, but I don't just mean taking the correct mundane step to get to your result, but also employing the legitimate paranormal forces, psychic abilities, all these kinds of things that you have in pursuit of, having a more magical life. And having a more magical life in a way that your life is better. Okay. And that seems to be kind of straightforward. It seems to be, I don't see that as particularly complicated. And I'm not really sure where the rejection of that comes from in some quarters of the magical community. I mean, there's obvious stuff like the non-toxic gatekeeping idea of, well, you shouldn't. There are some traditions that are closed and they require initiation. And well, you need initiation to do this practice. Okay, some of that kind of stuff is just it's part of those traditions and so on. It doesn't mean that you can do nothing without them. And I mean, that's one of the things that I picked up from when I was studying Tibetan Buddhism is that, okay, so in order to do a practice in Tibetan Buddhism, according to the tradition, you need an empowerment from a lama to do certain aspects of the practice. And if you want to learn more about that, research it, look it up. I'm more a Thelemite than a Buddhist, and if I go into too much detail, I'm probably going to veer off in the wrong direction. But we are taught that there are certain steps of the practice are not closed in that way, like some of the basic meditations and so on that are associated with those practices. And it's like a number of them are like there's some additional stuff you can add if you have the empowerment. Really, the thing about gatekeeping in that context is I want to make sure that people aren't in the situation where they don't really know what to do. They're getting out there, getting interested in magic, and maybe they ask a question that is completely stupid. Okay, there are stupid questions, or more to the point, there are ignorant questions. I'll say it that way. Ignorant is more correct, in that somebody who doesn't really know anything about magic, their whole exposure to it might have been, well, I read this fantasy novel and magic seems cool. Well, what's wrong with teaching somebody like that magic? Okay, sure, say, all right, read this, study this, practice this. And, don't wait until you're absolutely sure it's absolutely perfect before you do anything. Here's some basic stuff that you can start doing right now to make your life more magical and start you going in the direction that you want to go in. And again, I don't personally think that should be very controversial. And if someone is having resistance to that, I kind of don't get it. Okay, I do think that a lot of the stuff online isn't even, in the service of, well, we're trying to make sure that all these unworthy people stay away, which is, what I guess, some people may think. I'm not even going to characterize that, but a lot of it is just posturing and status. And a lot of the people doing this, well, they have their course and they want you to buy their stuff versus the other guy's stuff, or and the state of classes and stuff out there. While on the one hand, I understand it is reasonable for people who are magical teachers to be compensated for their time. Okay, that is completely reasonable. It's also like, don't pirate the occult books. It's like we occult authors are not rich. Okay, or more to the point, those of us who are rich aren't rich from our books. I'll put it that way. And the thing about it is that you want a situation where the practice is something that, people can approach, as opposed to something that is all marginal off here in the corner. As I said, I've stated my reasons for why I think, that's a good thing to incorporate into our culture. How we can do that from an artistic standpoint, because art inspires. That's a good thing. And the problem with this idea of, people who are, trying to argue back and forth about, whose class you should take and all this kind of stuff. And, how expensive they should be, how much you should pay for this or this. And, it does make me look at that and say, I do understand why a long time ago when people came out with some esoteric stuff, they said, well, we don't charge for teachings, because you know what, this like commercial market for teachings can be kind of silly. And it leads to a lot of, well, I mean, that's in my class, but you have to pay me for me to tell you. And it's like, I'm not really very interested in a world where the secret orders of old, which I think are not nearly as, they're not as like, impermeable now as they used to be. So much stuff has been published that you could generally find it. But I don't want to see that replaced with a world where, oh, yeah, well, now you can get it, but instead of being initiated into this order, well, now you have to pay me and take this class. And you can't get the information otherwise. That's not a world I want either. That's also not the world we're currently in, but it's not the world that I want to see. You know, and part of the root of that is I think that people, well, first of all, people need to be inspired by magic. I think that happens to some degree. That's the kind of thing we're doing artwork, doing writing, doing these kinds of things, putting, our, magic themed ideas out there into the culture in a way that is going to draw people in. And maybe that is re-enchanting the world. It certainly is re-enchanting the culture or continuing to enchant the culture, because I think some of the stuff is around here. I mean, I don't think that, for example, Harry Potter, I don't think would have been a huge hit unless, people really had this kind of interest in magic. And the same is true with, and I'm talking in my own field of writing primarily, but you have things like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, super popular, more of an adult magic kind of series. And I don't think that if people didn't find magic an inspiring idea to begin with, I don't see where that popularity would have come from. Okay, so the transition there is to get the idea out there that, okay, well, magic isn't quite like what it is in these fantasy treatments, but here's what it is like, and here's what you can do with it. So to somebody who, doesn't hang out at occult bookstores, maybe has, some kind of an ordinary job or whatever, should be able to pick up magical techniques, and to the degree to which, they're willing to actually do the practice, they should be able to get some results that they can apply to their lives. And again, as I say, the more people who are doing this, I think the more people who are going to be like gravitating toward a world in which they can live according to their true nature. And at the same time, becoming less reactive in ways that, spur violence, spur conflict, and so on. And these things will improve the world, obviously, person by person. It's kind of like the New Age idea of, well, we'll get everyone enlightened. It'll create this kind of field of, something. And then that's going to do, that idea is out there in the New Age. And, it's this idea that, well, if enough people are doing this, you get this kind of habit of nature, Sheldrake kind of thing that's going to pull people in that direction. I don't know if that's true. I don't think that magical ideas have reached enough of a saturation point where we could say whether that's true or not. But what I will say is that having a situation like that, in which, maybe in which more and more people are coming to it, it'll help us, I think, figure out, is there some kind of a point where, it reaches some level of significance and then people are kind of drawn into it, like the idea of, things can become so popular that they become self-sustaining and so on. And I think that magic is something that we can do that with, as long as we're avoiding, the obfuscation and secrecy. And at the same time, if we can put a lot of, compelling creative products like artwork and so forth out into the culture where people are going to see them, can be drawn in by them and inspired to, hey, I'm going to give this, esotericism thing a look. And if they decide to integrate that into their lives in a way that is, open as opposed to like restrictive and secret, then, really we've got an exoteric movement there. And that is a wonderful thing. Magic literacy would help people not believe that, Satanists are a huge percentage of the population doing nefarious stuff. That is a fundy myth that goes back to like the 1970s and the Satanic Panic. And we've got like some QAnon people believe this. It never really has seemed to die. And it's this thing that exists in the fundamentalist Christian world of, the idea that, well, we're under siege by the devil and stuff like that. And I'm like, what a pessimistic way to live. Not that you should be like a bright side or positive everything, but there really isn't this great adversarial force that is, doing all these nefarious things. It's like, it's just silly. I mean, and there aren't even enough occultists total to perpetrate any of that stuff. Now, the number of occultists could change in a sense, and I say change in a sense. The number of magic practitioners, I actually don't mean occultists, I mean magic practitioners, could expand, and that could change in the context of a world where magic became more exoteric. And the additional benefit is that by demystifying a lot of it, right, people can look at it and say, oh, well, some religious fanatic over here is saying, oh, well, this is being done by these evil people. And you look and say, oh, well, there's absolutely no point for anyone to do that. So why would that even be a thing? Magic doesn't work that way. This is an idea of magic they've got that doesn't hold up to any of the evidence we have, and so on. And if we could get to that point, that would be a happy thing. And the final point that I keep making is that really, if we want to understand how magic works, okay, and focus on it experimentally and really get to the underpinnings of what is the connection between, our personal consciousness, the universe out there, and, how are these things done? I think the best example we have of how incredible things were discovered about technology is in the physical sciences. I mean, look at what computer technology has done. I was just like talking to a friend about how, they got this like new super fast internet. And it's like, okay, well, so you realize that's like, some ridiculous number of T1 lines. Back in the 90s, the T1 line was like, ooh, if you had it, you had major bandwidth. And it's like, a T1 line, I think, is something like 1.2 Mbps. I mean, it's compared to like broadband internet that we have today. It's like, it would be silly. It's like you could sell a T1 to your house. I mean, you wouldn't have enough bandwidth to do half the things you want to do on the internet. And that happened because, people invested serious effort in researching it. People did, serious scientific experimental work, finding out the best ways to do things and optimizing things. And that's where we really need to go with magic. If we want to really understand exactly how it works, what the limitations are, what's the best way to learn it, what's the most effective way to practice. If you want to figure all that stuff out, we have to get to a point where something akin to the mainstream scientific method can work with our technologies. And we're not going to get there by keeping everything secret over in the corner. We're going to get there by bringing this idea into the culture and making it a regular accepted part of that culture. Okay? And I'm not meaning, conform magic so you can sell it better. I'm not talking about that. That's kind of already been done, and that's called New Age. And there are various things in the New Age that, they lead into, groups that are exploitative, and ideas that are half true. Things like The Secret. Okay, New Thought, right? New Thought is this idea that, if you think only good thoughts, only good things happen to you. Okay. And it's based on this idea that your thoughts like deterministically create your world. And well, they don't deterministically create your world. However, thoughts also don't do nothing. It's a case where thinking and directing your thoughts in a certain way can influence the world around you. And that's exactly what we do as magicians. And that's exactly what we have practices to optimize. So the general tenet of it isn't wrong. But then it goes off in this direction where, well, that's all you need to do. And since it's deterministic, if a bad thing happens, you must have had a bad thought. So, really, it's your fault. Every bad thing that happens to you, that's nonsense. But the idea that thought can have influence, the general idea is right. But again, it gets watered down. A lot of, half-truths kind of get thrown around. And so that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about taking magic and putting together an effective version of it that a person can practice without a lot of really complex stuff that, they need to study, figure out, whatever. Just, a few basic rituals, which really are not that hard to learn in terms of some of the other subjects we study. And then how to apply those basic rituals to move your life in the direction that you want. And if you want to, advance further with the practice, lay out a roadmap for that. And I think that, that thing is available. I have one version of it called the Path of Initiation on Algoides that you can find. And most of the traditions, have their own way of working with it. Basically, I would be aware of, toxic exploitative practices. I would be aware of, toxic gatekeeping, where you're told, oh, you absolutely can't do this thing that you tried and it seemed like it worked. That's not good, and so forth. But being able to follow something like that in a fashion, basically, and get as far in it as it's really your will to do. It's like, everybody doesn't need to be a master magician, just like everybody doesn't need to be, a fantastic writer. Everybody doesn't need to be a fantastic artist, and so forth. But it's a thing where in magic, there is kind of a genericness to it, in the sense that you can use magic to enhance your creativity. And in that sense, okay, in addition to creating artwork that communicates these states of consciousness and so forth that we work with, you can also use practical magic on yourself to make yourself more creative. I have done a few experiments with that, and I think I've gotten somewhat positive results, but I'm not sure yet. So it's one of these things where, you do have to do it for a period of time. But it's out there in the tradition. Crowley wrote about Victor Newberg, how, Victor Newberg, when he was practicing magic, he wrote all this fantastic poetry, and then he abandoned magic, and it just wasn't as good. Crowley was speaking derogatively toward Newberg there, but it is clear that, in the foundation of our tradition, magic is something that, it is an entirely reasonable thing to use for increasing creativity, increasing artistic skill, and increasing, hopefully the communicability of the art that we're putting out there. So it's going to inspire people who are going to be interested in picking up the practice and thus leading more magical lives in an exoteric sense. So I'm going to stop there. I'm at almost 45 minutes. We will be back next week, same time, same channel, with another Ritual Night talk. I haven't decided on the subject yet, but I'll get there. So, I'm just gonna add, I should have said this at the beginning. Okay, this is our YouTube channel. So like the video, subscribe to our channel, click the little bell for notifications. I got to say that now that I'm a YouTube content provider, and I keep forgetting, but I'll get it down one of these days. And so what that'll do is, it'll notify you when we go online, and you'll be notified when new videos come up, new live streams come up, and so on, if you're already subscribed. So also donation link, we appreciate any and all donations, as I said at the beginning. And I think it's pretty clear that, you know what to do if that's something that you want to do. So with that, I'm going to sign off for the evening. Thank you all for watching, and have a great rest of the night. Love is the law, love under will.